Now, we're going to get back to some of the monetary policy around the world because Turkey's central bank yesterday, they also made a move and they actually, wait for it, they cut the benchmark interest rate by 100 basis points, and that's despite inflation of more than 80% on a year-on-year basis in August. Simone Foxman has more on that decision. So Simone, what are the economists saying in reaction? What have they been writing?
Yeah, I wrote down a smattering of the responses in my notebook. One economist messaged me last night to say he was shocked. Mohammed El-Arian tweeting that this defies economic logic. At the same time, however, Timothy Ash, a Blue Bay strategist who's very prominent in commenting on Turkey, said that, this policy rate doesn't even matter with inflation over 80%. So these cuts here, not really that important. The central bank, for its part, saying that this was in a response to a slow loss of momentum in economic activity. Most economists arguing that this appears to be a thinly veiled attempt to express support for President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's re-election bid. Remember, he has to have elections by the middle of next year, and his going strategy has been juice the economy despite the high inflation numbers, and he will win. At the same time, interesting to note, another headline coming out, this based on Bloomberg sources, that the central bank will cause the banks to cut their fees on commercial loans. One of the things that's really angered businesses has been the spread between that benchmark interest rate, now 12%, and the actual rate they're paying for commercial loans, which is just over 20%. So that an interesting factor to play in here. But of course, we're looking at the weakest lira against the U.S. dollar ever, really.
Yeah, I was catching up here in the IFC with the CEO of a Turkish shipping company. This is incredible what they have to put up with in terms of access and convertibility of some of the foreign currency. Let's get to Israel for a moment, because the caretaker prime minister made headlines when he called for a two-state solution for the Israel-Palestine conflict at the UN General Assembly. What is the significance?
Yeah, Yair Lapid, who's the caretaker prime minister here, the first prime minister in 6 years to call for this two-state solution. So he's bringing back up this traditional response to the Israel-Palestine conflict that really hasn't been heard as Israel's politics have moved increasingly to the right. This got a mostly positive global reception with President Biden in the United States calling this statement courageous, but the real focus is probably on the Israeli elections that are taking place in early November. Lapid returning the issue to the long-term issue, the existential issue for Israel, rather than essentially making this an election about a response to Benjamin Netanyahu, whose right-wing parties are amassing and frankly have a little bit more support. This may be a play to try and bring in more centrist, more leftist voters, get them to turn out despite some disillusionment in the last couple of years. It also could be a play to some of the Arab parties. Remember, we saw a split in some of those parties, and the two parties that are remaining may be more willing to actually join a coalition government. Right now, the edge seems to be to those right-wing parties, often led by Benjamin Netanyahu, but we'll see how this shapes up. These polls typically unreliable, and this is going to go on for another 6 weeks or so.
And then we have the death toll from protests in Iran that rose to 17 as per state TV. Is there any indication of what could come next and how the government might respond?
Well, the government response seems to be intensifying as these protests spread across the country and as they become increasingly violent. There have been clashes between protesters and volunteer militias called the Basij, and that contributing to some of this death toll. The general expectation for Iran watchers here is that the government is going to ramp up its crackdown. There have already been widespread reports of internet disruptions. This bodes very ill for those who are supporting a return to the Iran nuclear deal. We've seen strategists across the street cutting their expectations here as it becomes more difficult for Washington to sort of tolerate what's happening in Iran. And notably, I want to point out an interesting headline. Elon Musk calling for a waiver so that his Starlink satellite internet service can continue operating in Iran despite sanctions, and a bipartisan group of lawmakers asking the Treasury yesterday for that to go through as Washington seems to push back against the Iranian government at this point?